the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, and certainly the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, and evidently to get their commitment to ensure the sustainability of LIAT. Well, I'm here today to share, in essence, layman's concern about LIAT and how we can place LIAT on the path of sustainability, or to speak more broadly about the issue of competitiveness and connectivity of air transport within the region, especially the OECS subregion and Barbados. Quintessential, especially in the tourism sector, for those countries that are dependent or heavily dependent on tourism. So it's important economic growth and resilience, and certainly the overall sustainability of tourism within the region. Now, travel within the region appears to be trending downwards. We're told this morning by Dr. Smith that we have seen a 30% reduction in air travel within the region. But on the other hand, we have seen a significant increase, in fact, a 200% increase in extra-regional travel. And perhaps this is due because of a number of factors. And I would take the opportunity to look at the factors that are attributing or contributing, for that matter, to a reduction in air travel within the region, and some of the factors that are hampering competition within the region. Then to look at a synopsis as to how we can handle these issues and to ensure reliability in connectivity, and at the same time to look at LIAT and to see how we can place LIAT on the path of sustainability. Now, poor connectivity can be attributed to factors such as the region's environmental and systemic issues, the physical location of the islands, the multiple stops, and the inefficient airport operations within the region, limited carriers resulting in higher levels of connecting multi-stop flights with corresponding multiple security checks. That in itself has been an impediment, and I'll speak later to a possible solution. And also operational inefficiencies within LIAT itself. I mean, LIAT has a relatively sick business culture that has to be addressed. And in as much as we'll focus on some of the deficiencies within LIAT's operations, you have to understand that they are fundamental market structure problems that will impact on the viability of LIAT, so that the solution is not exclusively about improving operational efficiency within LIAT, but also to recognize that the very size of the market and the fact that the airline business is capital intensive would render most, if not all, airlines unprofitable, because you're spreading those fixed costs over a very small population base. It means, therefore, that there has to be greater cooperation and coordination between LIAT and possible CAL. Maybe at some point to look at the possibility of a merger between the two. Now, there are some who may argue that by having that type of monopolistic structure, that it will not give rise to competitive forces to ensure efficiency and optimal performance of the airline. But the reality is, few airlines globally turn a profit. And that is because the business is so capital intensive. The problem becomes even more acute within the Caribbean, especially within the OECS region, considering our small population base. And LIAT has to spread its fixed costs among a very small population base, which in essence increases its fixed costs as a percentage of revenue. So having a wider market to operate within clearly could provide opportunities in terms of increased economies of scales and the attendant efficiencies to make LIAT more viable in the future. Now, there are some issues even at the level of our airports in terms of burdensome airport operating policies, and we have regulatory issues. There are problems in terms of border controls. The fact that you literally have to have entry and re-entry into different countries within the region. In fact, I find it extremely instructive that within the OECS region, that is part of an economic union, that there is no free movement of people, that you have to continuously fill out an entry form, when indeed what should happen is that as soon as you enter one island within the union, that you should be able to travel freely. So those are some of the impediments that we have that are clearly undermining the efficiency in the movement of people and evidently the operations of LIAT. Now, LIAT also has a fundamental problem in that it is undercapitalized. It has a mountain of debts that it is unable to service. And at the same time, the airline does not have enough assets. In order to service the Caribbean effectively and efficiently, LIAT needs more planes. That is the reality of it. And perhaps some form of future consolidation between LIAT and CAL could result in the acquisition of more assets. I mean, CAL has ATRs that they can actually consolidate with LIATs. In fact, I believe that their assets are underutilized because, again, those planes are operating within a very narrow population base. And I made a point earlier that in order to sustain LIAT, it has to operate over a larger population base. But outside of interregional travel, it is also important for LIAT or any consolidated airline to target more tourists. And that in itself will also increase the amount of individuals that will utilize the service of the airline and to help to provide a broader base. So whereas interregional travel is important, LIAT, or any entity for that matter, whatever you may call any new entity, any form of interregional transport system, must, in essence, have access to an external market to sustain itself. Because I suspect that within the Caribbean region, the market is just too small to sustain any airline, even a consolidated one on its own. Now, one of the problems that we have within the Caribbean that is affecting our tourism product is that in many instances we do not have sufficient or adequate connectivity. There are many countries within this hemisphere that are accommodating tourists from different regions. So, for example, you have tourists from China going to Cuba. You have, for example, Turkish Airlines operating in Venezuela. Turkish Airlines has one of the most extensive networks. But at the same time, we do not have a regional carrier to bring these tourists from, let's say, South America into the Caribbean, or even from Cuba or the Dominican Republic into the Caribbean. LIAT at one point operated the Dominican Republic route, but was unable to sustain that route for various reasons. And I have suspect, too, that it may have been due to other factors other than demand. So it also comes down to the whole issue of operating profitable routes and running LIAT on a business basis based on profitable routes rather than continuing to operate LIAT exclusively as a social institution to provide connectivity to some countries. Now, governments need to seriously examine the reform that is necessary in order to place LIAT on a sustainable path. And it will come at a cost. I mean, integration in itself is expensive. And as I said before, LIAT is fundamental to the integration movement. And just as we sustain these various institutions within the region, CARICOM, the OECS, etc., it is just as important or even more critical to sustain LIAT. So it means, therefore, that the governments within the region must come together and provide some form of support for Liat. We know that there are market problems in terms of the size. There's a problem in terms of costing. One of the problems that we're faced with our regional transportation is the fact that the airport taxes have proven to be extremely burdensome and would have impacted on demand. And that evidently would have accounted for the 30% reduction in interregional travel, which means, therefore, that governments have a responsibility to look at those taxes and to reduce them, not to create a crisis in their respective countries, but at the same time, to reduce them to the level in which they can help to increase demand in regional travel, while at the same time increasing revenue so that there's no overall negative impact on their domestic revenues. That in itself obviously will help to create further demand and obviously to make the airline or any future airline for that matter more viable. So in terms of recommendations for reform, one of the most critical areas that the governments need to address is to reduce the airport taxes and the various service fees. Even landing charges and other charges could be waived or perhaps contributed towards the recapitalization of Liat. But in essence, Liat needs fresh cash. There's the possibility of the present shareholder governments converting Liat's loan into government loans and to convert those loans into equity for Liat. But that in itself would not resolve the issue. It is also important for Liat to get fresh cash to cover its working capital requirements and at the same time to facilitate the acquisition of additional assets. The airline business is not cheap. It is costly. And it will require the commitment of the countries within the region. And I would say all of the countries. In fact, it should be a policy of shared benefit and shared burden. You cannot have a situation in which 3 countries or 4 countries carrying the burden for the benefit of all the other countries within the region. And we have already established that reliable air transport is quintessential to the economic resilience of the region. So it means, therefore, that all of the governments have an obligation to invest in the sustainability of Liat. And I'm of the view, the very firm view, that Liat cannot operate without a subvention. And that all of the governments, the 6 independent governments within the OECS and Barbados, should come together and provide a subvention to Liat. As I said before, the market structure itself would render Liat unprofitable. But again, Liat is important to moving people, not only citizens of the region and residents of the region, but also to move tourists. And I believe that a repositioned Liat could be utilized to provide greater connectivity to bring more tourists to the region. And that has to be one of the focuses going forward. Not only about regional travel or interregional travel, but at the same time to allow Liat to expand into other markets to bring more tourists to the region. And when I say other markets within this hemisphere, so that we can attract more tourists to support our hotels. Because clearly, if we do not have the airlift, then we'll not be able to keep our hotels full. And it shows very clearly that Liat is not only important from the standpoint of interregional travel, but it's also important in terms of sustaining our tourism industries, especially for the countries that are heavily dependent on tourism. So one of the solutions that I'm proposing is a subvention by all countries within the region, certainly the OECS and Barbados. And as I said, there's also the possibility in the future to have further consolidation, perhaps to have a single airline, one that will service countries from Jamaica in the north, probably going to Guyana in the south, and for all of the countries to commit towards subsidizing the airline. I mean, when you look at other regions, you look at the United States with all of the resources, even in the UAE, they have airlines that are not turning a profit, and they are subsidized by the state. But there are other economic benefits that would have justified the subsidy. Caribbean region is no different. So we have to see the subsidy as an investment in our tourism product, an investment in the integration of our people, to move goods, to move people, and to ensure that the integration process works. Now, I find it extremely interesting that our governments are prepared to support marketing campaigns for other airlines, extra-regional airlines. They're even prepared to give support to a number of cricketing teams in the millions of dollars annually. But an institution as important as LIAT, that is so critical to our economic sustainability, to our economic survival, you have governments that are refusing to participate, to contribute, and to find every reason why they ought not to contribute. Now, I will accept that there are some legacy issues involving LIAT, but those legacy issues, from my understanding, most of them would date back probably a decade or decades ago. So the time has come for us to look forward and to be proactive in our strategies to ensure sustainable airlift, to ensure a competitive airline, one that can service the needs of our people, and not to be looking backwards and to bringing back old stories of inefficiencies within LIAT and governance problems. It is a given that all those problems must be fixed as a condition precedent to additional equity injection into LIAT. But having fixed those problems and having addressed other market issues to include pricing, the airport taxes that are making pricing so expensive, then it is important for the governments now to go the extra mile and to provide a subvention to ensure the sustainability of LIAT. There's no doubt that the airport taxes would have reduced demand. In fact, what it would have done is that the differential in pricing between interregional and extra-regional travel would have narrowed. So whereas Caribbeaners in the past would have taken frequent leisure trips to different countries within the region, they find it perhaps more cost-effective or perhaps better value for money, maybe traveling to Miami for a weekend than to travel within the region. So in essence, we have hurt ourselves by introducing these taxes, and I think that is a need for us to come together and to ensure that for interregional travel that there's a different pricing mechanism, a lower pricing compared to extra-regional travel for these airport taxes in order to reduce the overall costs of tickets or travel within the region in order to increase demand. Now, it has been proven that the pricing is elastic, so we do know that on the basis that we reduce the pricing, then clearly there would be an increase in demand. Now, it's also instructive, too, that we have argued vehemently against the UK's introduction of the APD. But on the other hand, within the Caribbean, we have done or introduced similar policies that would have literally reduced the demand for sub-regional travel or interregional travel. So again, these are some of the issues that we ought to address, along with the other regulatory issues. And I also believe, too, that there's a possibility for the diversification into other services, to include the possibility of the establishment of an MRO, a maintenance and repair operation to service a region. That in itself could be a potential profit center that could provide additional revenues for LIAT going forward. So, in essence, the whole objective here is to boost regional travel, to use LIAT not only as an institution, but as a policy tool to increase demand for our tourism product, to help to move people from different markets, tourists from different markets, in order to increase the contribution of tourism to national development. So those are my initial comments, and the comments coming from a layman. I thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. All I could say is that I think we should now get rid of all the aviation experts and start listening to some of the laymen in the region, especially those that have the power to implement. So we look forward later on to a discussion on what are the mechanisms for implementation of these recommendations, and why have we not implemented them in the past. So I now hand over to Justin Ram, who is the chief economist of an institution that emphasizes development, and therefore I hope implementation of all the policies and recommendations that have been made over the many years. Justin?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. And yes, I can assure you as an institution, we do emphasize implementation. But I'm here this afternoon to speak with all of you about why we have done this particular study. When we were conceptualizing this particular report, we always had the notion within our minds that something needed to be done about air transport in the region. Would it be around taxes, fees, and charges, airport security, utilization of the assets, the regulatory environment? But one thing that always struck us whenever we brought this particular topic up was that where's the evidence? And so in doing this report, what we seek to do is to provide you with an evidence base about why we need to look at this very important industry in the Caribbean. Now, this morning, listening to the speeches, first of all, from the Honorable Prime Minister Mitchell, and then, of course, from Honorable Gaston Brown, as well as from our own President Smith, a good friend of mine who was in the audience tweeted to me, "No pressure on that seminar later, huh?" And in fact, so I was so pleased that in all of the speeches, they mentioned the importance of air transport and why it is we need to pay particular attention to it. So I'm going to be fairly brief with this presentation. The report is available online, and so I'm just going to go through with you. First of all, give you an idea as to what is happening currently in the aviation industry in the region. And I think from the statistics that I will show you, you will recognize that we need to do something. I will then present to you some of the analysis that we have done around the challenges associated with competitiveness and connectivity, and to show you from our initial analysis, our assessment, what are the economic benefits of these particular reforms. So what's the current state of aviation in the region? When we look at this particular chart, it's very clear to us that in the Caribbean, because of where we are, and as the Prime Minister indicated, we mainly come from small island developing states, and we need to travel quite a lot. As you can see there, that red line at the bottom shows you the global average. Passengers boarding per capita in 2017. Around the world, that's only 0.5. Here you can see it's as high as 6 in Belize. And we have not included, we have some BMCs that are even higher than this. In Turks and Caicos, for example, it's well above 10. So it shows you how important air travel is for our populations. Now, looking at the current state of aviation, again, what has been very useful for us to see is that extra-regional travel has increased over the period 2007 to 2016. However, that circular in the middle there shows you that intra-regional travel has declined. And why is that? And I think the Prime Minister has hit upon some of the reasons for that. But it's not surprising, you know, when we look at the data, when we look at the seating capacity on routes from the Caribbean to extra-regional destinations, there's a much greater capacity. So for example, between Bahamas and Miami, on average per week, we have over 7,000 seats available. In the intra-regional market, between Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, there is less than half of that. So it's not surprising, therefore, that we have seen this explosion of growth with respect to travel outside of the region to the region. But when it comes to the the travel within the region, that has declined. And there are a number of reasons for that, which I will touch on later on. What I'm here to do today is also provide you with some real evidence around specific data on air transport in the Caribbean. This particular chart shows you the average revenue per passenger per kilometer by country in 2016. The global average is about 8 cents. But as you can see here, in some of our countries, it's much higher than that. In Anguilla, to the left, it's approaching almost $2.50. And that is, of course, as it relates to intra-regional travel. The extra-regional travel, the amounts are a bit low. So this actually tells us that it's very costly to travel within and outside of the region as a comparison to the global average. And in the current state of aviation, what about the assets, our airports? Here we have just provided you with a snapshot of some of the major airports in the region. Montego Bay, Nassau, Port of Spain, and Bridgetown. What these charts show you is that there are a number of hours, and that's hours of the day at the bottom on the x-axis, where we don't have any movement of aircraft at all. But in some of these airports, there are actually hours when we have a significant number of aircraft movements. This particular slide shows you that there could be room for us to manage our assets more efficiently. That is in terms of when should we be scheduling flights, when for arrivals and departures, to utilize the asset base much more efficiently. There's only Port of Spain there where we see consistent use of the asset throughout the day. However, when we look at the number of movements on any given hour, it is still considerably less than what you would expect to see in large airports around the world. So, what is this notion of air connectivity? So it's an indicator of a network's concentration and its ability to seamlessly move passengers from their origin to their destination. And there are a number of ways that we can define air connectivity in terms of the types of air connectivity. As you could imagine, there could be direct air connectivity. It actually reflects direct services available from a given country, city, or airport. So you could imagine that if you were living in London, you have many direct routes to many parts of the world from London Heathrow, or even from London Gatwick. We don't have that same level of connectivity in the region for obvious reasons. There's also indirect air connectivity, which incorporates destinations that can only be reached with one or more stops. I think we're all very much familiar with this in the Caribbean. This is primarily how we tend to operate. So for example, if I'm going from Barbados to Montego Bay, I would typically have to take a flight to Miami, change at Miami, and then go on to Montego Bay. Or if I really want to get up early in the morning, I take a Caribbean Airlines flight down to Port of Spain. Sometimes I have to come off that flight and then go on through security again and then reboard the same plane. But then I then have to go on to Kingston, and perhaps even from Kingston I have to take the Knotford Express up to Montego Bay. So it's really quite indirect. And of course we know about the hub. The hub we're quite familiar with. Miami is quite a good hub that we have all utilized. But even within the Caribbean, we do have some hubs being utilized. Barbados, for example, is a hub. Antigua, and to some extent, Port of Spain as well, where you actually go to that particular airport and you can actually get a lot more connections to various destinations that you normally wouldn't have from your place of residence. So what about the change in connectivity in the region? At a global level, this is coming back to that chart that I showed you before, the Caribbean's connectivity to extra-regional markets. So as we can see here, for most of our borrowing member countries, we have seen a significant increase over the period 2008 to 2018. For some of our countries, there has been a decline, however. Now, you're probably seeing it's more than just our borrowing member countries here. We actually took an opportunity in this report to assess the connectivity of some of our neighbors. So we have included in this study the Dominican Republic, Cuba, the French territories, as well as some of the Dutch territories. So for example, you can see that DR here, that their global connectivity has increased. What's quite interesting is that the country that has seen the greatest increase in global connectivity has been Grenada over this period. Again, it's also a great testament to the reforms, the homegrown reform program, people showing great, I guess, confidence in the economy of Grenada. However, when we look at what has happened in the regional connectivity, the reverse is practically true. There has been a significant decline in intra-regional connectivity for primarily all of our borrowing member countries, only a few. It's only Trinidad and Tobago there that has seen an increase in intra-regional connectivity. The other increases there, of course, are Aruba. And you can see Martinique as well as Guadeloupe. So there is something going on here within the intra-regional market. Why is it that we've had this great expansion, if I go back, compared to what has happened intra-regionally? Now, we think that the major causes for this decline of lost air connectivity are related primarily to the high costs of taxes and fees, lack of liberal regime, that is to do with the regulatory environment, as well as the inefficient operations of the asset. And here, when I speak about assets, it is not only about the utilization of the airport asset, but also the utilization of the aircraft assets as well that we have in the region. So let me provide you with some evidence around taxes, fees, and charges for return travel in June 2018. At the extra-regional level, so the chart on your left shows, for example, the costs of a return, the extra-regional from BGI, Bridgetown to Miami. As you can see there, taxes, fees, and charges make up about 24% of the overall fare. Between Port of Spain and Panama, that's 32%. Between Nassau and JFK, 32%, and St. Lucia and Miami, 24%. Now let's focus a bit on the intra-regional market. Between Bridgetown and St. Vincent, taxes, fees, and charges make up about 37% of your full fare. And as you can see from this particular chart, between St. Lucia and Bridgetown, it actually makes up more than 50% of the full fare, as much as 56%. So I guess, Prime Minister, those of us in the panel, ladies and gentlemen, you can see quite clearly that this must cause a problem if we believe in price elasticity of demand. So there's actually this virtuous circle of air connectivity. And I'm not going to spend too much time, but we believe when we looked at the study that there's this circular relationship between aviation and the economy. Aviation, increased aviation connectivity can actually have a great stimulating output on the economy. And when economies are increasing and when economies are growing, that can also stimulate the demand in the aviation industry as well. So what are perhaps some of the benefits of enhanced air connectivity? What are the suggested strategies? We're saying, first of all, that we need to improve operations efficiency, and that is both at the asset level, on the ground, and of the utilization of the aircraft. Liberalize the market, so we're saying the regulatory environment needs to be looked at, and we believe that the issue of taxes, fees, and charges needs to be an area that we have to consider seriously. Now, what are the benefits of this? increased air travel demand is likely. For example, we're saying a 25% reduction in taxes may increase traffic in BMCs by about 13% in 2036. Now, we have done a number of scenarios. Now, I'm just presenting to you quite a conservative estimate here. This is just a reduction of 25% of TFCs. If we were to reduce taxes, fees, and charges much more, then the increase in traffic is likely to be much higher than just the 13%. There's actually going to be an improvement in connectivity and time savings. So, for example, we have done some analysis of the route between Bridgetown and Kingston. And currently, it takes about 5 to 8 hours to go from Bridgetown to Kingston. We believe with some of the changes in policy that can actually be reduced to 3 hours. Therefore, and that is a significant time benefit and hence monetary benefit to travelers. Overall, there are economic benefits to an improvement in connectivity. We can provide an additional 140,000 jobs in the sector by 2036. And I have some more data to show how this could work. So we have analyzed the changes that are possible in terms of reduction of taxes, fees, and charges, an improvement in the utilization of the airport assets, as well as what we can consider to be the transformation of the regulatory environment in the region. I know, Chair, you are an expert on that particular topic, so I'm not going to go into much on that. I'll leave that to you. But what are the possible benefits? We believe that if we were to do these things, and this is a very, very conservative policy adjustment, that in BMCs, we're likely to see about 140,000 extra jobs in the aviation industry if we were to make these small tweaks to policy on aviation in the region. If we were to include the wider region, so those other 6 countries that we have looked at, we're likely to see an increase in about 290,000 jobs. In terms of the economic impact on GDP, so we're looking at the direct, the indirect, and induced impacts of these changes in policy. We are estimating that an additional $1.9 billion of GDP is possible. And in the wider region, when we look at the larger markets, that's likely to be about $4.4 billion. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Justin. Could I ask one question on your final set of economic figures? Do you believe from your studies that the reduction in TFCs will generate increased funds into the treasuries of the governments?
I do believe that. It's probably not going to happen immediately. There's likely to be maybe a bit of a dip in terms of treasury revenues initially. But when we look at the price elasticity of demand for air transport in the region, a reduction in fares will lead to an increased movement of people within the region. With people moving around the region, they are coming to the various countries, actually spending more in those countries and boosting GDP. Then there are the spin-off effects from that with respect to the benefits for the Treasury. There's likely to be an increase in VAT receipts or sales tax increases. And then if there's increased employment as well, governments can also expect to see increases in PAYE receipts. And this is why at the end of the presentation, I showed what were the economic benefits. $1.9 billion, and that's just from a very conservative tweak in the policy. $1.9 billion in extra GDP will generate significant taxes for our economies.
I share your view, but I have I suspect that ministers of finance will want to see hard figures rather than GDP figures, right? And I wondered, therefore, if the CDB could expand its study, maybe with some selected countries, and demonstrate what, in fact, would be the impact on the Treasury, which would then make it a lot easier for ministers of finance to agree with the proposal. I don't know what Prime Minister Brown has to say. Right, exactly.
Compensatory revenue. So I do accept the proposal, absolutely.
Well, we're very happy to do that analysis, maybe country by country. What we were utilizing here was just a gravity model at a regional basis. So the mere fact that from the analysis that we're generating economic activity, increased economic activity, we know from that. I mean, I can apply generalized multipliers on that would generate an indicative tax amount. But I think what we would need to do for further research is to look at it at individual country levels to see what are the likely impacts for the individual treasuries.
I'm sure you will do it.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we have two choices here. We could go into the details of Justin's presentation, or we could look at the recommendations and discuss the most effective ways of implementing those recommendations. Because I think, let's face it, the region has a significant implementation deficit, and there's nowhere greater than in regional aviation matters. Not extra-regional aviation matters, but in regional aviation matters. I don't know whether you folks agree with that, or do you want the panel to address the details of Justin's presentation?
That's here.
Sorry?
I just wanted
to...
you
will. I'll allow you. I just want to get the All right, I'm not too sure which way the panel wants to go, but I mean the audience wants to go. But what we like to do is to start off with Liat, because Justin's presentation is a bit broad, and there are some specific Liat issues. Well, not really only Liat, it's really the regional airline issues, certainly within the Eastern Caribbean, right? That it may be important for us to understand, even as we seek to implement the recommendations that are coming out of Justin's study. Julie is first female CEO, et cetera, of Liat. But certainly from my perspective, more importantly, she is driving the rebirth of Liat in terms of the quality of service that Liat has been provided in recent times to the region. And I really think that we should commend her for the work that she has been done in recent times.
Yeah.
Right? It is will play a big impact on air connectivity within the Eastern Caribbean. But I would also ask, while addressing that, if you could explain why Liat operates a multi-stop scheduling model as opposed to a more direct service model. Because one part of the air connectivity issue is the multi-stop model that Liat has always utilized. Julie?
Thanks for your kind remarks.
Not kind, genuine.
Yes. As the main provider for air connectivity in the region, I think we are very proud to be able to make a contribution to improving air connectivity. And I'm happy to say that over the last 6 months, post the hurricane, that we have seen some significant improvements in our on-time performance. We are running year to date over 80%. And certainly for the month of May so far, it is over 90%. So we are actively working to improve and to deliver a service that the region needs. I just want to step back a little bit, though, because what is happening here is we are in an environment where there are small markets, thin routes. The population sizes do not support commercial activity in every instance. And that is driving the multi-stop that LIAT is doing. We pick up passengers from one location onto another because we are actually combining and trying to address the limited size of the population. The direct flights require a certain market size. And this is why it is important for us as a region to understand that the international carriers will not address the interconnectivity issues that we have. We need a LIAT, even if it is not LIAT, it's something with a different name. You need a regional airline that is going to connect us, to connect the territories. It's part of what we need to function as a region. And I don't know if you could even imagine what the region would be like without LIAT, right? So part of what is driving the operations of a regional airline like LIAT is the market that we are in and the limitations that that brings to the operations. Now, what's happening here is not that unique. Regional airlines exist all over the world, and they have very similar problems. The international carriers fly the long-haul routes. The regional carriers tend to focus on the smaller markets. And what the research is showing is that these regional airlines tend to need support from their governments. And this is something that I think we need to come to terms with here in the region, because we look at it and we say LIAT should be profitable, but yet still we want to be able to have a flight first thing in the morning, connecting every territory to Barbados or to Trinidad or to Guyana. It may have 20 people on it, but there is still that expectation that we are going to provide that service. And we do need that service, but it has to be funded. So I think one of the things that has to happen is that we have to come to terms with that fact. And I know the study, Justin, raised the issue of increasing capacity. But usually, if you are in a commercial environment, the capacity would be driven by traffic. If you have an increase in traffic activity, then people would put on additional flights and so on. Now, where that traffic is not obvious, then it needs market support. And this is why our own governments in the region will have conversations with the international carriers to come in from some new city, bringing additional capacity into the region, and they provide market support. But that same approach is not adopted in the regional environment. And again, I think this is one of the things we need to do. To get that capacity and that additional activity, it needs that kind of support from the territories. And this is a missing component. I would say also generally, both the studies that were done indicated that there was this decline in regional travel. And part of the reason for that, and of course there are some economic issues because we had a downturn in the economy worldwide, is that there is this almost total focus on international travel coming in and not enough focus on the intra-regional travel. And for me, what is needed is a set of measures, taxes included, that would help to boost intra-regional travel. How many of the marketing and tourism organizations in each territory have a section of their budget that is commensurate with the contribution of the regional, intra-regional travel to the economies? And I just want to share with you some of the stats on LIAT's importance to the subregion. In terms of tourist arrivals, and this is based on data from CTO, The LIAT passengers account for about 26% of the arrivals in Barbados, 16% in St. Lucia, which is a little low, 59% in Dominica, 30% in Grenada, 31% in St. Kitts, 30% in Antigua. This is just to show that that intra-regional activity that we are providing through LIAT is part of a significant movement of people throughout the region. And if you look at the departures, which is the flight activity at the airport, it is even higher. The number of flights that LIAT represent in Barbados is 52%. In St. Lucia, it is 38%. In Grenada, it is 50%. In St. Kitts, it is 45%. What that means is that a lot of the activity of this interregional travel is driving the activity at the airports in our region. And we also have to take that into account when we assess the impact of the regional airlines as we move forward. So for me, an important part of this discussion is just understanding that intra-regional travel is important to the region and that it will contribute to economic growth, and that the governments need to commit to a series of measures that will help that growth to happen. And I know the taxes issue is really a very difficult one because the governments are using the taxes to fund the airports. But for me, I think you have to take one step. And perhaps one of the steps that can be taken is the in-transit taxes. This is particularly important for LIAT in terms of the multi-stops. It means that we will pick up additional taxes for routing a flight through Barbados, or routing it through Antigua, or routing it through St. Vincent, or Port of Spain, just because we are doing that multi-stop flight in our schedules. So even a single action like eliminating the in-transit taxes across the region becomes important. And I think that that is something that we can advocate, and that it could be a practical measure while the governments assess what else can be done in terms of the other taxes.
Could you answer one question for us, Dan? The daily utilization of your Avro fleet, how does that compare with the average global utilization of the Avro fleet? Not Avro, sorry, ATR.
Yeah. I don't know the numbers exactly, and I don't have those before me, but what I know, it is below the global average. And it's below the global average because, again, we also have a lot of airport restrictions that we are working with. There are airports in the region that close at 8 o'clock, another set at 10 o'clock. Barbados, Antigua, and Port of Spain are more or less 24/7, but everything else is within a limited time frame, which means that that puts restrictions on us in terms of how we can schedule our flights. So we can't do a late night flight to every airport in the region. And even when we go beyond 8 o'clock, let's say in, I think it's Grenada that had the 8 o'clock restriction, we are paying overtime charges. These are some of the issues that make it much more difficult for a regional airline to operate and to operate effectively. So for me, these are some of the issues on the end of the government and the authorities that need to be addressed.
All right. And would it be fair to say that for the international airlines, the major driver of utilization of airports in the Caribbean is in fact a function of their overall scheduling and the preference they would give to how they use the airports in, say, like places like Miami and New York and so forth, right? That takes preference over how they would utilize the airport facilities in the Caribbean. And therefore one has to be a little careful in terms of drawing sometimes global, using a global average to draw conclusions on what's happening in the region. Prime Minister, you spoke about a Cal-Liat merger, right? And once upon a time, it really was once upon a time, there was an idea floated where Liat would provide at the time it was ABROs, let's say the TRF routes across the region. And Cal would fly the wider Caribbean routes, regional jets or things like the Bombardier, as well as the let's call it international jet routes. That may be one way in which there's a merger without upsetting too many people within the region.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, there has to be some level of collaboration. We are all within the same region. Even Trinidad and Tobago, they're now diversifying into tourism. They're trying to increase their tourism product. So they will also need to move more people into Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that there are synergies to be exploited by bringing the two carriers together, if not a merger, at least some form of strategic alliance or partnership, so that they can exploit the synergies that come with that level of cooperation. At the same time, they will also be able to possibly reduce their fares in terms of the increased economies of scale. And I don't know if Cal still gets cheap fuel from Trinidad and Tobago, but if that is the case, that perhaps could be extended to Liat as well.
They don't.
They don't?
They don't.
Well,
I know that. Cheaper than Liat.
Yeah.
Cheaper than Liat? Well, I would imagine. So, those...
Yeah, but that's not a government thing. That's
But it's a Trinidad thing.
A Trinidad thing?
No, it's not a Trinidad thing.
Well, what is available...
No, I know. It's not a Trinidad thing. It's pure supply and demand.
So
Cal pays less for fuel in the Eastern Caribbean
than we do.
With a lower right than you do.
Mm-hmm.
Based on the demand.
That one is weird because the demand is lower. Right. The volume uplift is lower.
That is probably a technical point. I just wanted to comment on the proposal about the merger. Right. These discussions have taken place over the years. It would be a sensible approach if it could happen. But needless to say, it would have to be a decision at the political level. I think historically the focus on Cal has been more to address the Trinidad issues rather than a regional approach. That's just my thinking. So unless there is a clear position from the government that, look, this is the direction we want to go, it is difficult to advance it. We have commercial relationships with Cal. We actually interline with them. The level of the interlining arrangement just with Cal and with all the other airlines that we interline with is impacted by technology. Liat needs to modernize. The airline industry is driven by technology. And what you find is that we have lagged behind in those investments for financial reasons. The company has just not had the resources to invest in those kinds of things. So the interline agreements need to be upgraded in a way that would allow us to take benefit from those commercial arrangements. So I think that still exists. And also, we are collaborating with Air Antilles and Veneer in an initiative recently that would see us strengthening our interline arrangements with them and possibly leading to some code share arrangements that would give us better connectivity across the region. So we're looking to address this issue at a commercial level, even though there may be some political decisions that might need to be taken. So it wouldn't stop us from moving forward with some level of collaboration. But of course, a merger would be at a a different level.
Through you, I have a question for Julie. The northern Eastern Caribbean is relatively underserved. And perhaps part of the reason for it is because Liat actually transitioned into some larger planes. And many of those aircrafts or let's say the airports in some of those northern islands, Eastern Caribbean islands, cannot accommodate the aircrafts, or perhaps, for that matter, it's not cost effective to operate your larger planes in those markets. The question is there any possibility for Liat to, let's say, broaden its fleet to include smaller planes? I know that you have been quote sharing with other small airlines, but the truth is many of them, they have assets that are extremely old. And the question is whether or not there's not the opportunity for Liat to get some smaller planes, reliable planes, planes that people would want to fly on. And if not, what are the objections?
The issue is that this requires investment.
Money.
And we come back to the issue of the region kind of deciding what it is that you would like to see from a connectivity point of view and making the investment to make it happen. The approach that we have taken at this point, and I think in your address you mentioned that the 10 aircraft that we have is not enough to service the region. Our own assessment of what is required is a fleet of about 15, which would allow us to do some of those routes. So we would like to get there, but it's a question of the investment and how that's going to be funded. These other airlines are existing and operating, and our view at this time is that no one airline can do everything in the region. So we are really looking to see how we can collaborate with these airlines. They are already existing, already flying on some of these routes. How can we collaborate with them to extend our reach and to improve air connectivity? So I don't actually see it as either or, but Liat is constrained by not having the investment available to take some of those decisions.
You also have an interest in behavioral change, Prime Minister. Above Antigua, generally, it's small, relatively private airlines, flying small planes and making money.
Sure.
Right? Below Antigua, it's airlines flying larger planes.
And making losses.
And making losses, right? And Julie mentioned...
I don't know if that's entirely true. There are airlines that come in and out of the region, especially the smaller airlines, and they come in and out because they're not making money, right? And some of them who come in, they come in for a short period and they don't survive. So it's not as if this is an area that is very profitable for the airlines.
No, it's
not
not very
space.
profitable, right?
So there are a lot of airlines that come in and they don't survive. Small ones too. So it's a challenge for the region, but I think there's a place for the small carrier. Some of those routes, it wouldn't make sense, 6 or 8 people. You do need some of those small carriers. I think what we should be trying to achieve is to make that connection and to cooperate with them in such a way that those small streams can connect to the Liat network and to move through the region.
And I think this is one of the driving forces behind the Massa agreement, right? Where it was supposed to provide an opportunity for the smaller carriers to be able to provide service on the very thin routes and release some of the larger assets to fly the more profitable routes. That's one of the many advantages of it. Now it's interesting that Massa was approved by heads of government in Haiti earlier this year, signed off by the heads of government. But only 3 countries have now signed and ratified it, and therefore it remains a piece of paper that is of no use to the region. And There's some of us who would like to set the heads of government, to set the various countries a target and have it ratified for heads of government conference in July. Now, we're looking for a prime minister to spearhead that initiative.
I see. I guess I'm the only one here, right?
That's right.
Noted. Good.
Because that would also have a great impact on.
Yeah.
Now, also, Julie mentioned the security issue. All right. It seems to some of us, when you look at that, that's dependent on the regulatory authorities collaborating. Right? You have 4 of them. You have the Eastern Caribbean, you have Barbados, you have Trinidad, and you have Guyana. What if we put 4 of them in a room, lock up the room, no food, right? With a mandate to come out of that room with the procedures that will remove that. And we may have, something may happen, because some of the studies that were done in the OECS said that high prices and poor service, and security was identified as the poorest of the services, basically equal in terms of disturbing, reducing traffic in the OECS countries. In fact, some people said if you reduce prices but you kept that poor service,
We still have a problem.
we still have a problem.
True.
All right. It's for people. So again,
Yes,
I leave it
we
up
have to get the regulators together to address these issues. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll certainly undertake to bring these issues to the attention of my colleagues.
On behalf of all of us in the region, thank you, sir.
Okay, a pleasure.
Can I open it up to the floor? If there are any questions from members of the panel? Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Eric Deans. I'm from Jamaica. My background is maritime transport. So I wanted to open it up from just looking at it interregionally to looking at it from the bigger picture. And you probably recognize that in Jamaica, our transshipment port, 90% of the cargo is what we call transshipment. Only 10% is domestic. It's the same thing when you look at the bigger international airports. And I'll use 2 case studies, Dubai and Singapore. Dubai has a population of 5 million people, but their airport, Dubai International, handles 80 million passengers. They're building a second airport to handle 120 million passengers. Singapore handles 60 million passengers with a similar population base, small population. The point here is that those airports generate significant in-transit revenue. They are situated in regions where they act as the hub for that area. Dubai for the Middle East and Singapore for the Far East. Our region is similarly positioned. The Caribbean sits in the middle of North and South America, 800 million person markets. So I have 5 suggestions or 5 questions. Recognizing that transport is a derived demand. It's derived from the movement of people in the region or the movement of cargo. How can we position our air transport system, whether it's our airports or our carriers, to support that demand of that 800 million person? Secondly, how can we take advantage of the economies of scale of operating larger airports, larger carriers, to capture some of this in-transit revenue. And because of the economies of scale, you'll have lower costs. How, as a region, can we really integrate, not just, we've talked about integration in the region, but from an air transport perspective, how can we integrate our air transport services? For example, in the US, to travel inside the US, you have to fly an American flagged carrier. Or in the European Union, you have to use a European. Cabotage restrictions. Could we implement a similar arrangement where, because of our regional integration, our economic integration, to travel interregionally, we have to fly on a Caribbean airline? And lastly, if we move that route towards these larger airports and getting revenue from what I call in-transit or transshipment activities, not just passengers, but also cargo, utilizing cold chain and other things. Instead of the passengers subsidizing the airport, having the airport subsidize the regional carriers. Those are my few questions.
Well, that's a heavy mouthful, right? You understand and maybe repeat some of them, and let's find out who wants to take some of those questions.
Yeah, I could take some. I'm happy to attempt to answer some of them. Maybe I'll start with your last one about airports subsidizing the carriers. I think it's a very, very useful point that you make there. And again, it's always useful to look at the case of Montego Bay, the Sangster International Airport, which is a PPP arrangement. When you look at that PPP arrangement, the incentives for me are all correct. You have a private sector entity running the airport, so they have an incentive, they need to make profits. So how do they make profits? They need to have quite a lot throughput through that airport. They also have a lot of very useful services for anyone going through that airport. So people, when you go through that airport, there's a lot of shopping experiences that you can actually participate in. But when you look at the wider economy, for me, the incentives are all correct. Because the more people going through Sangster International Airport, I mean, there's more people coming to Montego Bay, more people filling those hotels. So I think in many ways, by having the incentives, the right regulatory environment, you have the incentives set up in the right way. You are, naturally, you're now going to flip the script, whereby the airport becomes a real conduit for economic activity. Yeah. And I think when you also spoke before about the opportunities not only for passengers, but also as it relates to cargo, logistics, for example, I think that's the way we have to start thinking beyond. Whenever you go to Panama, for example, PTY, you pass through there, I'm always amazed at what they have managed to do with that particular hub. And I've wondered why we have not managed to do that in the Caribbean. So for me, the airport, and that is why in the report, we have suggested that the utilization of the asset in a much more efficient way can help drive significant economic activity, which in turn then drives much more demand for air travel, let's say. So I'm very happy that you raised those points, and it reinforces some of the findings of the report.
I just wanted to add something there in relation to Panama, because Panama is a good example of what was done to create that hub. And it was a collaboration which included a lot of investment from the government, right? Collaboration with the airlines to make the hub work. And I think it is the investment and the collaborative approach that is critical if you're going to try to create that hub activity. And of course, the hub has to make sense in the routing internationally. But without that commitment, right, from the government and collaboration with the airlines, it really isn't going to work.
And Panama is part of the Caribbean.
Yes.
So I think that answers the first question.
Yeah, if you look at Panama, where it's positioned, Panama essentially acts as a hub for that section of the region. But I wanted to carry on to the point that Justin made. In Dubai, their airport has been set up like an airport mall. An interesting statistic I learned about the Caribbean is that one of the main reasons why tourists come here is the duty-free shopping, the ability to get goods cheaper than they could either in the UK or... The average spend in Dubai is $100 per passengers. So you imagine how much you make from 60 million passengers, you know? That's what, $6 billion of additional revenue that you would be attracting from one airport. And that's how we have to look at it, the economic multipliers, the linkages to the economy. And the airport becomes the driver. And the airlines become the supporting services.
Well, I'm not so sure I would agree with you with Dubai, right? Dubai is the driver. That's where the driver is. The airport supports the Dubai. And as part of the support, it continues the same trust as Dubai.
Well,
right? But Dubai, you know, people go to Dubai not to shop at the airport. People go to Dubai as an attraction. And you now take advantage of that attraction of Dubai to further exploit the advantages that you could get at the airport.
I agree with you, but there are in-transit passengers that don't go into Dubai because they're utilizing the network.
No, I know they don't go. That's right. But you have, this Dubai is a very interesting model. The strength of that is Emirates, right? Where Emirates, people wish to be associated with flying on Emirates. All right.
So that brings out the statistics which came out in your report, which shows that it's a long-haul services which are growing and the interregional service is declining. Yeah. So to the extent that we can attract the interregional carriers to make a stop in the region, that has to be the thrust.
Yeah. But you have to take into consideration that there is another significant constraint, the issue of capital. I mean, to build a small terminal may run a country probably about 100, 150 million US. And if you're going to have a significant airport property that could rival, let's say, one of those properties in the UAE or even in Turkey, it takes a significant amount of capital.
It does.
Most of these countries are extremely small with very limited resources. So I take a point in terms of the suggestion, but there are capital constraints that you have to take into consideration.
Well, you're correct, Prime Minister, but you can't have a hub airport in every country.
True.
You have to select. It's just like in the maritime case. You can't have a transshipment port in every region.
But location is also important.
Right.
So, for example, I mean, which country? I mean, and maybe Grenada, but can Grenada raise the capital to build such a facility?
No, Ian, if I may, I guess, and this is why we touched on the point earlier around the liberalization, the need to now consider, I guess, innovative forms of financing, and this is where the public-private partnership comes in, because what we're saying is that we understand that our regional governments don't have the fiscal space for this type of investment, but there are private sector players who would be willing to make these investments. We have to be
innovative, exactly.
But it also brings me to another point that we always raise at the CDB, is around the doing business environment. How are we going to encourage greater investment, I guess, in the aviation industry? We have to look at, is it easy to do business in the region? What are the challenges and the obstacles to that? So in that particular, I should say, how do we overcome this challenge? The recommendation of the liberalization, the regulatory environment, couched in all of that really is a doing business environment. How do we improve it? How do we make it easier for people to invest and to perhaps build that 150 million airport terminal?
It's actually about $1 billion, but...
Hi, good afternoon. Mitch De Silva, Citibank. And Dr. Ahmed, my question really comes off of the statement you just made. You know, when I looked at the statistics you presented, I have not read your report showing the reduction in passenger traffic intra-regionally from 2008 to 2018. I was curious to understand if you looked at trade statistics for that same period of time, intra-regional trade, what has been the trend? And I would hazard a guess that intra-regional trade has also diminished over that period of time. So to the point you just raised, you know, what is the causality of this intra-regional problem? Is it the price, because we are price competitive as an intra-regional carrier? Or is it, as you just said, the impediments to actually doing business in the Caribbean, and therefore businesses look extra-regionally to make their profits or to invest? So fundamentally, to address the vexing problem that we have in how we move people around the region more efficiently, is it primarily a focus on the barriers that prevent that movement and the trade barriers that exist even within CARICOM, which we claim to be a common community, but frankly speaking, there's not as much commonality as you would like in the community.
Want me to? Should I respond?
I mean, I think we agree.
Yes.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
But my point then is, how do you achieve that? You see, I keep getting back to a point that we say we know the solutions, but then we do nothing after having defined the solutions. And that, to me, is a regional problem that we really need to start addressing. But, sir.
I think it needs to be turned on.
This one's on. This one's working. Just come talk to this one. Okay. I was just saying a quick thank you to the panelists for an interesting set of presentations and discussion. I have one suggestion and one question in 3 parts. The suggestion
that makes it 3 questions.
is maybe more towards targeted to the CEO of LIAT. Have you ever considered doing flash sales to fill your empty seats? Many people have made the comment that as you get closer to your travel date, the prices should be going down and not up, but they continue to go up. And many people in the tourism fraternity are of the view, and maybe we also of the view generally, that we used to be last-minute travelers. We can't afford to be last-minute travelers because it's too expensive to travel last minute now. So that's one thing. If you were to do a flash sale, you might want to consider using it as a test of the elasticity that you mentioned, although you're only dealing with particular segments of the market at certain times. But it might be a good test to start with. And one of the things you might want to consider is to share the burden of the price reduction with the governments. If you could set up the administrative mechanism to do that.
Right,
so that's a recommendation I would like to make. I certainly would benefit, but I'm sure many others would benefit as well. So that'll be a practical way of testing the market. That's one. And so here's my question. Relates to what the last speaker from the audience was the point he was making about in effect, motivations to travel. So my question is centered around motivations to travel. The first part of the question, to what extent are travel options substitutable? In other words, if we stimulate intra-regional travel enough, will extra-regional travel decrease? In other words, will people travel less out than they are now and travel more intra-regionally? Or are we talking about a pure increase in travel? Because we keep on making the comparison that people have been traveling outside of the region more and within the region less. There's a suggestion there that there's a certain degree of substitutability. So that's my question. Is there really that degree of substitutability? And have you taken that into account in your elasticity calculations? The second part of it is, by extension, are there other things that we need to do to stimulate additional intra-regional travel? A link was made between intra-regional travel and intra-regional trade. But are there other economic and social motives to travel that we need to create to stimulate more intra-regional travel? And the third one is looking purely at your elasticity figures. The suggestion is that there's a very high level of latent or suppressed demand, that once you drop the prices, travel, inter-regional travel, it will automatically increase. Is that what that elasticity number is suggesting? I just wanted a clarification on that. And it would be interesting to know what methodology you use to determine that, because you can't observe it. So what methodology did you use to determine that elasticity? Thanks.
There are a few questions.
Okay.
I just want to say that we do flash sales. That's one of the promotional practices that we engage in, and this is part of the reason why sometimes people will say, oh, well, we're not going to book as a group because we're going to wait until there's a sale on the ad and they get the sales. The thing about the flash sales is that you can't keep doing it at the same time on every occasion, because then it doesn't achieve the objective, because people will just wait until you do your last minute flash sales. So we tend to do those flash sales selectively, and from time to time we do get a very positive response. But again, I think we have to look at the market and the environment we are in. I think the tourism organizations in the region need to do more to promote the activities within the different territories. I only discovered Antigua Sailing Week because I'm in Antigua, and Liat's home base. But for me, Antigua Sailing Week is a really beautiful experience. You don't have to be a sailor to enjoy it. And I would like the rest of the Caribbean to know that. We talk about Guyana and the falls. People are looking for experiences. And the reality is that the numbers who are going to the US, those are the same people who are looking to take a decision, some travel-related decision. What we need to do is to make sure that the travel options that are presented to them are wide and varied, and that they know that they can choose a travel option within the Caribbean. So we need to get a bit more creative ourselves as airlines. We have to work on some packages and so on with the hotels and with the tour travel agents and so on. So I would say it needs a different focus. We need to all appreciate that interregional travel is important to us, and it's not just going to drop in our lap. The Europeans are doing it for their own interregional travel across Europe. The Americans are doing it for themselves as well. And we are just expecting it to happen in the Caribbean. So part of it is that we have to make that extra effort to promote each territory, to realize that there is a uniqueness to every territory in the region, and that we promote it among ourselves. We are going to spend the money, so let's spend it in a way that will benefit everybody.
Maybe I can just touch on the question of the latent demand and demand elasticity. We actually do have some data which shows that there is significant price elasticity of demand in the Caribbean. During the period when Liat was actually competing against Caribbean Star. There was a lot of competition in the market then, and so prices were actually much lower. If you look at the passenger data during that time, it was much higher. So it showed that once prices came down, people had the incentive to travel more. So we do have the evidence, and we've utilized that evidence as part of our analysis of price elasticity of demand. You also asked about what are the other attributes that contribute to demand for air travel. Well, I guess a bit of microeconomics 101 would suggest that, you know, their income is also very important. Huh? If people have disposable income and they have money left over in their pockets, they would probably want to travel not only for business but for leisure activities. And I think Julie actually made a very interesting point early on, and she just repeated it. It's about the marketing of our particular destinations. Why is it that perhaps our regional persons who want to travel are attracted to perhaps going up to Miami or to Orlando, for example? Well, I guess those destinations are quite well marketed, but I think that people are also now looking, as Julie has just said, for other types of adventures. So you made a very good point around Kaicha Falls, for example. I think if we start marketing these particular destination experiences to our regional counterparts, you would find that many more people would certainly want to travel to those particular areas.
What about the substitutability, intra-regional versus ex-regional and demand?
Yeah, we're not looking at this thing as, well, if intra-regional travel increases, then there's likely to be a decrease in extra-regional. We're seeing this as an overall increase in travel. So there's not that substitutability issue here at play. Maybe at the margins there could be, because as intra-regional markets become a lot more attractive, at the margin for someone who was thinking of doing that extra trip up to Miami, let's say, they might now consider going from Barbados, for example, to Antigua because now the market, the price is now conducive for that marginal travel to occur. But overall, we are looking at an overall expansion of air transport, and it's not that substitutability issue as such.
But in fact, the research shows that the environment for substitutability is improving. The research seemed to indicate that the Caribbean travelers in the past, shopping was a key element for going to Miami and New York and so forth. But the online shopping experience is now reducing that incentive, right? And that is, in fact, leading people to be more attracted to regional vacations than before. So there is some degree of substitutability that's taken place.
Thank you, Mike Sylvester from Grenada. I want to, of course, thank the panel for the very insightful presentation. Prime Minister Brown made a very interesting point on the issue of legacy governance issues. And I just wanted to ask the panel whether and to what extent those issues have been addressed over time, or whether the study that CDB would have done, whether it would have identified those issues and make recommendations and so on in this regard. Thank you.
I'm sure Julie could do justice to that question.
There were actually two studies. This one that Justin presented the findings on, and a study which we did jointly with CDB, looking at air transportation in the region and looking at LIAT's role and the way forward. And of course, in that study, one of the issues that came up was governance issues. Governance issues broadly in terms of the board of directors and the shareholders and so on, and also, of course, our internal environment in terms of the unions and how we're going to put that on a different footing going forward. These issues have been tabled with the shareholders because some of them are fundamental issues. The governance issues have to do with also framing what is it that you really want LIAT to do. Do you want us to connect every territory? And if that's the case, then we have to have a funding model that supports that. If the issue is that you are balancing profitability and connectivity, then if you are confronted with a situation where you have to make a choice, what is the choice? These are some of the framing issues that the shareholders themselves need to kind of give some guidance on that make it much easier for the management team to deliver on some specific objectives. And then, of course, there are some that are under the control of the management. And right now, that's what we are focused on. We don't need the shareholders to improve our on-time performance, as you have seen. We are working on our customer service. I hope that you will see an improvement in that, too, if you haven't already. So there are some things that we are definitely working on, and there are others that we need to have some collaboration with the shareholders. The issue with the unions is that all the union agreements are really outdated. Outdated meaning that they were probably developed in the 60s and the 70s, and then we just kind of roll them forward by adjusting the rates, and they are not consistent with modern commercial activity. So one of the major things that we are going to do is to implement new agreements for the various union groups. And you would appreciate that that is a challenge in itself because we have 11 different unions. But that's on the agenda. The issues are being addressed systematically, and the shareholders are scheduled to meet sometime soon. Hopefully now with the new government in Barbados, we'll be able to schedule that meeting, and some of these issues will be addressed. But I can assure you, in terms of the discussions going on and the perspective of the management team, that we are committed to address the issues that need to be addressed.
Julie, there's also speculation about procurement abuses and other abuses, to include absenteeism, sick leave, abuse of sick leave. I mean, I don't know if you care to comment on those issues.
We are rolling out across the company a performance management system that is driving a level of accountability in the company. We have just started that process, so it's in its early stages. I mean, you are seeing the results of the on-time performance now, but to tell you the truth, we rolled out those changes from the beginning, I would say probably from about the middle of 2017, but the hurricane impacted that, and you couldn't see it and feel it in the way that you feel it now. So we have started the process on a lot of these things, and I think that the efficiencies that we expect to see in the operations will come. I just want to stress that some of the challenges that you see at LIAT are about the lack of investment in change, right? You will complain. We looked at a range of issues coming through to us from our customers, the on-time performance, customer service, baggage, whatever. But when you look at some of the issues and you look at how we are dealing with them internally, a lot of it is manually done. And unless you can modernize the company, it will not be possible to bring it to a level that would allow us to compete as a commercial airline. And we have to, and I hope that the shareholders will see that as an important decision to be taken about investments that have to be done in certain areas of the company. But once we can make those investments, I'm sure that you will see the improvement that you expect to see in LIAT's operations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A couple of questions and observations. Dr. Ram, thank you very much for the study. Sorry, I have not read it, so I do have to ask the question. At the end of the study, is there a recommendation about implementation of any of the actual measures that you presented? Because immediately upon you presenting the study, the chair said that one of the things maybe that we need to look at then is the direct impact on the national treasury. And my immediate thought was, oh dear, we just finished one study, now let's just have another study and delay the actual implementation of the one that we have. So my question is, while we're doing that study on the actual implementation or impact on the national treasury, what could actually be rolled out? What is the point of investing all of that intellect and time in doing a study like this without actually then immediately being able to put something in place as a consequence of the study? So that's the first question. The second question is a comment and question is to the head of LIAT, who was sitting next to me this morning. I did not realize that, so good morning again. First of all, there are so many uses that could come to LIAT except for the fact that it's costly. We do in-field studies. So I'm putting on strictly my lecturer hat now. We do in-field studies for our students. They're master's students. It's an environmental program. They're not going to learn in a classroom. And we're based in Barbados, but we're representing the region, so we try to go to the Grenadines, and we go to Belize. But we're having to draw it back because we just don't have the resources, and it means that subsequent cohorts of students may not benefit from that opportunity. I happen to know that in CSEC and Cape, secondary schools across the region want to travel to other Caribbean countries so students could have in-country experiences of things that, I mean, if you're sitting in Barbados, you're not going to know what a mountain looks like, let's face it, or a river. Anyway, the point is the opportunity to move large groups of students every academic year. There is that. We have festivals. We have food festivals, dance festivals, sports festivals. There is no lack of people who want to move across the region. But the truth of the matter is that it's costly, and we understand the reasons for the cost. But I don't think it's that people don't know. I think people just say, oh, I'd like to do that, but it's cheaper to go here, so I'm going to go here. Whereas, and certainly I made that decision many of the times, and so do my friends. The question to you, though, is linked to the panel that I was on before, which is about resilience. Hurricane season started as far as I'm concerned, because I don't think it ever goes away in a real sense if we're constantly planning and preparing for it. You don't wait for a special date. You have to be always ready. So I'd like to understand in the context of resilience and the discussion we had before, and I don't know if you were present for that, how LIAT is getting itself ready to be a part of the resilience of this region, how LIAT itself will weather the storm and be a part of the solution for all of its member states in terms of weathering the storms that are coming, not that we may have, but that are coming. And then to the only sitting Prime Minister in the room, one man stands alone. You're quite right. When you started, it would really have been great to have your colleagues here, because fundamentally, it seems to me, as I listen to the discussion, that the inability to resolve issues when we're going to talk about them year after year after year after year after year is not an infrastructural thing. It is not an engineering thing. It is not a money thing. Issues, yeah. All right? It is a Trinidad thing, it's a Jamaica thing, it's a Barbados thing, it's a St. Lucia thing. It is how we as a culture, right, can come together and say we're UE, or we are the West Indies cricket team, or whatever, but then very quickly become Barbadian, or St. Lucian, or Antiguan. And that fundamental cultural inability, sometimes you can put them in the room, don't give them water. Food is water you have to deny people, not food. It won't make a difference unless you can break that issue of the nationalistic thing. And perhaps it's inappropriate to say that as I have said it, but I think it needed to be said. Because honestly, these other, the chair of LIAT has said it, the head of LIAT has said it. Other regions are running airlines. The examples are out there. The solutions are there. But we seem to want to get mired in the problems. Do we really want to solve the problem? Because for all of the intellect in this room, it does not seem to me as if the solutions are astrophysics. The solutions are there. The thing to tackle is a cultural, mental issue of this mine, this yours. I'm not playing with you. I'm taking my bat or my plane and going home. So I've thrown a few things at you. As the only sitting Prime Minister, it'd be really nice of you to tell me how you honestly feel, if you could, about that last thing that I just mentioned. Thank you.
I think I'll give the Prime Minister a little time to think. I just want
I guess we'll give an
assure
extra 5
you
minutes.
that the LIAT's emergency planning system is pretty robust, and that's part of the reason why we were able to survive the last hurricane. As we speak, our emergency planning team is planning for the upcoming season. And although we talk about 2 hurricanes, over the period of the last hurricane season, we had quite a few systems. And LIAT has to plan every time there's a system of any significance, because it is likely to affect either the north or the south, and we are spanning both the north and the south of the Caribbean. So our planning systems are actually in pretty good hands, and I'm confident and proud of it. What was a bit of a shocker for us, I mean, you know that you have weak points, but it was a shocker for us, our IT and communication infrastructure, and that came up in the resilience panel earlier today, that because we haven't been making those investments, that area is really very vulnerable and weak, and so we are working on it. But it is something that requires a lot more investment and effort on our part to make sure that we can come out of a hurricane season like the one we experienced last year. Of course, there's a broader issue in terms of financial resilience, because hurricanes are here to stay, and they will impact LIAT. But I think if we say that we are part of that social and infrastructure for the region, we have to come up with a model that will sustain LIAT and allow it to survive and have some financial reserves for situations like that.
Right. You want me to go now?
Yep.
Okay.
What was the question? How do I feel? Hopeful. Notwithstanding the fact that we have a problem with insularity within the region. I think you captured it in your comments. One would have felt that with such an important issue covering air transport and connectivity, that you would have had greater participation at the level of the heads. In fact, I came here with the expectation that practically all of the heads within the OECS would have been here. Now, I have to admit that at least one head needs absolutely no convincing, and that is Prime Minister Gonsalves, who has been a champion for improvement in transport competitiveness and connectivity. So for me, again, even though I remain hopeful, there was some level of disappointment in terms of the level of participation. Clearly, an expert document was done by the Caribbean Development Bank. We have identified issues. We know the answers, but in terms of having the heads here and to get a commitment, it is unfortunate that we have not been able to get them in a single space and to get the commitment. And I presume too that even in other fora, it is difficult to get all of the heads together. So without that level of commitment, I'm afraid that implementation will be protracted, but we have to remain hopeful. And I think, too, it's important, for all of us to reinforce the importance of getting our air transportation right. And also for the heads to understand, too, that there are a number of underexploited opportunities and unexploited opportunities, so that by getting, air transport competitiveness and connectivity right, that we could exploit those opportunities for the benefit of our people. I think generally speaking, the thinking is perhaps very narrow, or some heads perhaps very narrow in the thinking, and I believe that they suspect that the discussion is all about capitalizing LIAT and increasing the burden on some countries and committing others to make a contribution. It goes beyond that. I mean, clearly, in order to resolve it takes money, but there are other commitments that are required, other interventions that are required at the level of the heads. And I'm just hoping that, at some point, very soon, that we can come together unless the CDB can perhaps put together a special forum with the heads to get them in a single space, in a single room, for us to make concrete decisions. I know that there is some lobbying taking place. I know that they would have met with individual heads, and whereas there may have been some tentative commitments, what is required at this point is to get firm commitments from the heads so that we can fix this problem and to ensure that we have economic resilience going forward, and to recognize too that reliable air transportation is quintessential to the type of economic resilience that we are all seeking in our respective countries.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, I raised the issue about this further study because we've had previous studies on taxation, and there's been no traction. And I've gotten the strong impression that finance ministers and the finance Sherpas in the region want to see what the impact is on their treasury, because that's what they have to deal with on a year-to-year basis. They understand all the GDP stories and so forth, but they got to deal with. So I have come to the conclusion that unless we present that to the finance ministers and the finance Sherpas, we will not get anywhere with it, right? But in the meanwhile, that's why I've asked for that. But the MASA can be immediately implemented, all right? And I think implementation of the MASA is significant and almost central. It immediately liberalizes the regulatory environment in the region. It allows any regional carrier to fly between any 2 points, right? Right now, you are constrained by various bilateral agreements, all right? And the current MASA has something which says that if somebody believes that it will impact on the economics of the incumbent carrier, you cannot do it. So if I am a lower-cost carrier, right, I cannot do it because somebody will say, my price is impacting on yours. And it also allows for freedom of pricing and greater innovation on the part of the regional airlines. So, repeating, something that could be immediately implemented because it's been approved by the heads of government. It's been approved, isn't it right? It's signing and ratifying. Each country signing and ratifying it, and I think you need 9 for it to come into force or something like that, right? So that there are 3 down, 6 to go. There are 4 down.
4 down.
4 down, 5 to go.
Fourth one is Antigua.
So let me...
Yes, I agree. All right? I mean, again, personally, I have, in recent times, wondered if we shouldn't have some agitation on the part of people in the region, right? That this is what we want. We want to have the security problem sorted out, right? Mr. Politician, go get it done, right? Rather than, politicians respond to the real needs of the people. They got to get elected every 5 years, right?
Sure.
So I don't think we as a region, we as residents of the region, are in fact recognizing our power to get the change. We bitch and so forth at the airport, but then we do nothing. Right? Let's start.
We blame Leah.
Yes, and let's start getting our voices heard. Social media, right? And beat upon the people we vote.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be on this end of a panel for a change. I want to commend the panel. First of all, I want to thank CDB for the work that's been done. I don't know, Ian, I know you've been in the trenches on air transport policy for a few decades, but I don't know, and I guess I haven't read the study, But based on what was presented, I don't think we've had that in-depth study. The last one that was done on taxes was done by ICAO for us. I think must have been maybe about 10 years ago. I don't think it went in depth, but I think the point that Ian has raised for further data to assist the member states in making that decision is critical. Because a lot of the developments, for instance, the one in the Bahamas, the one in Montego Bay, the one in Barbados, the airport developments, what we are hearing is that the taxes go to amortize the debt for the developments. And I know there's one in Guyana being built right now, and I suspect what's going to happen. So the information in terms of the time lag between the reduction in the tax and the revenue inflow is very, very critical. But I think what you've done just reinforces the previous analysis that we've done, and I really want to commend you on that. I also want to thank publicly the CEO of LIAT. I'm a frequent flyer. You don't have frequent flyer miles, but I'm a frequent flyer for the service into Georgetown, and also for the service you've rendered during the hurricane season. I'm very much aware that you moved personnel, essential personnel, and evacuees. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Carl for that as well, because they also played a very critical role. The MASA, Ian, I have a good feeling about this one. Prime Minister said there are 4. I suspect his is the 4th signature.
Exactly.
Because we did have 3 until this minute, and I'm sure we're going to get a few signatures and ratifications in Montego Bay when we arrive there in a month's time. We did an interesting thing about 2 years ago. We called all of the CEOs of the regional airlines together to the Secretariat to sit down in a room. We didn't lock the door, but we sat them down in a room and asked them to start the conversation about some of the things that you raised, the interlining and scheduling and stuff like that. And when they left the room, we sort of let them talk. And when they came out, they said to us, we need to do this more often. I think they did that recently, earlier this year, and I think one is scheduled again for coming up. I don't know, CEO, if you're aware of it, but I understand from
there's one scheduled for
very soon
later this year.
To look at some of those issues. And the technology is one of the barriers, as you mentioned. We're very much aware of that. We're going to be doing the same thing with the security personnel, the Port Authority security personnel. When I leave Georgetown to go to St. Kitts for a meeting, my staff and I, we have to go through 5 security checks. 5. So we're going to be calling all of these security personnel in a room again next month, June, next month, to begin to see how we can harmonize that, to begin to see if we can set a standard and mutual recognition of the standards so that you can go through easier. And these are some of the things that we're trying to work on. But I think, I just want to thank you. We've been talking about the need to reduce the taxes, but on the other hand, you have to balance it with the revenue stream to upgrade the airports. So I think that information will be very useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We've gone past the time, but I think the questions have been extremely useful. I hope that we will see some action over the next couple of months, and that you folks will keep the momentum going in terms of trying to force the pace so that we get improvements in the intra-regional air transport system. It is really very important. So thank you very much for sticking around with us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.